Hello, welcome to another episode of Varsity360. I'm Columbian sports editor Micah Rice, joined once again by Meg Wochnick, and coming to you from the First Pacific Financial Studio in downtown Vancouver. Thank you very much again to First Pacific Financial for supporting the show and for their unwavering support of high school athletics and the community at large. But Meg, can you believe we're already a third of the way through the high school football season?
Every year it gets faster and faster. Yeah, so here we are going into week 4, the end of September. So a lot of great football this week. I can't wait.
Well, they say time flies when we're having fun, and we have been having a lot of fun. And this week in high school football is extra fun because of a unusual scheduling arrangement involving the 4A Greater St. Helens League and one of the best leagues across the river in Oregon. Meg, why don't you tell us what high school football fans can expect this week?
Yeah, so just a refresher. We touched on this back in the spring, refresher for those who were watching back in the spring, and kind of a recap for those who are a little unfamiliar with what it is. So this is a 2-year agreement between the 4A Greater St. Helens League and the Three Rivers League, which arguably is the best Oregon 6A league in the state. You look over the last really 12 to 15 years, and there's been sustained success when it comes to the postseason with a number of these suburb teams out of the Portland area. So 2-year agreement, which really was sparked by Stephen Baranowski, the 4A, 3A Greater St. Helens League president, also Camas' athletic director, trying to find a way to fill the void that Shelton, coming up from 3A, joining the league, having to fill that spot. So if you remember, Shelton got reclassified from 2A to 3A back in January as the lone 3A school in an otherwise only District 4 area where the 3A teams are located in Southwest Washington. They had to find a way to accommodate Shelton. So that's where they came into the scheduling for the 3As, but that left the 4As already with a small league needing to find just another non-league week and game. And so that's where Baranowski did his magic, and I think we're going to see some fantastic football. 3 of the 4 GSHL teams, Union, Skyview, Camas, will take on Westland, Oregon City, and Tualatin. So Battleground was invited to participate and elected the matchup just wasn't in their favor, so they decided to go and play another Oregon school out of Salem. But I can't wait for these Fridays games. It's going to be some fantastic football.
To give you, I mean, there's a million subplots and we can go into those in the individual matchups here in a bit, but to give you an idea about just how good the Three Rivers League is over in Oregon, it's a 6-team league, and it just so happens that 6-team league has 4 of the top 7 ranked teams in Class 6A. You have number 1 Lake Oswego, number 2 Tualatin, number 3 Westland, and number 7 Lake Ridge. And Tualatin and Westland are part of this crossover here in week 4. And what we're looking at coming up this Friday is Skyview versus Westland at Kiggins Bowl, Camas versus Oregon City at Doc Harris Stadium, and Union and Steve Pine, who obviously you talk about maybe one of the most successful high school football coaches in the state of Oregon's history. He goes back across the river to take on Tualatin. I thought it was interesting, Coach Pine, after Union got its first win of the season last week, told our Will Denner that Tualatin might be the best team that they will face all year. And that's saying something, being that they're in a league with Camas and Skyview.
That is, and if you remember, or maybe if you don't, I'll tell you right now, the final game that Steve Pine coached, leading Central Catholic last November to his 5th state championship in 10 years, his Central Catholic team beat Tualatin 45-21. Now, Pine also told me a couple times this summer that not only is Tualatin the best team that they're going to face in their tough non-league schedule, but they have who's probably the best quarterback, not just in the Northwest, but on the West Coast. And that is some nice words coming from a guy who is successful in his head coaching tenure as someone like Steve Pine. So there's a lot of familiarity there between Pine and Tualatin. That's going to be the first of two brutal games for Union. Remember, they've got Tumwater coming up in 2 weeks. Well, yeah, next week if we think about it, before they have an unscheduled bye coming up in week 6. So it's going to be a tough stretch for the Titans coming up with some pretty tough non-league opponents before league begins.
Well, Union versus Tualatin, a bunch of subplots there, a bunch of subplots also at Kiggins Bowl, because we have the return, if you will, of one coach, John Eagle, who coached Camas to a state championship and two state championships. Don't want to shortchange Coach Eagle. He brings his Westland team into Kiggins Bowl to clash once again against Steve Kaiser and Skyview. So we're going to see a familiar face on that visiting sideline at Kiggins Bowl.
It is. So homecoming for Coach Eagle, first time since the spring of the 2021 COVID condensed season that he will be back in Clark County. Back in 2022, just a few short years ago, he led Westland to the Oregon 6A championship game. So this is a team that's coming off a very impressive win hosting Sumner last week, 34-27. And this is typically what Coach Eagle does, right? If you remember back in his Camas days, he would go out and schedule the toughest teams that he could find in that non-league schedule, and he's doing that once again with this Westland team. They took on Eagle out of Idaho in week 1. They faced Sherwood just right down the road on Highway 99 from Westland in week 2. Taking on a great Sumner team, which is probably a top 3 ranked team in 4A in Washington right now, and now hosting Skyview team, which is a little bit banged up going into this week 4 game. But nonetheless, it should be a fantastic game, a fantastic crowd, and get there early because that's the 5 o'clock kickoff on Friday at Kiggins.
And Camas, you talk about Stephen Baranowski being kind of the mastermind of this whole plan. Well, he schedules for his football team Oregon City, a team with some history, but maybe not the toughest in the Three Rivers League. Still, it should be a great non-league test for Camas.
It should be. So Oregon City is ranked 32nd right now, and there are 42 teams statewide across Oregon 6A football. They're coming in 1 and 2. They do have some pretty good offensive weapons. A little history note, first time since 1934. These two teams are going at it, and we all remember where we were in that game, 1934. That's a game that Oregon City won 6-0. But Camas is playing very well right now and well deserving of the number 1 ranking that they have across a number of polls. So what's impressed me so far, and I have yet to see Camas, I'm hoping to see them this week, is the play of Jake Davidson right now. He's on pace for 30 touchdowns through the regular season. He's got 10 so far in 3 games. He's passed for 625 yards. But I think what's impressed me more is he's kind of taken that leap and being more than just your standard pocket quarterback. We're seeing him move the ball and make plays, a couple scramble plays against Lincoln of Tacoma last week with his legs. And so he's being a little bit more of that kind of dual threat guy for a guy who stands about 6'4". So very impressed with so far what the Papermakers have done.
Well, as we break down these matchups, and they're so enticing and exciting, and we've been looking forward to this week in the high school football schedule for quite some time, it kind of begs the question, why now? Why haven't the powers that be kind of agreed to have this similar arrangement, being that you obviously have a number of good programs here in Southwest Washington, and then it's not like there's a crocodile-infested moat known as the Columbia River, keeping teams from Oregon and Washington to play each other, and certainly they have in the past. Mm-hmm. I mean, in recent years, you've had Skyview taking on Jesuit as one example, but why has it not been something in the past that leagues have agreed to have this sort of crossover week? What's prevented this from happening?
Yeah, sure, you're right. There have been a number of years where we've seen kind of that 2-year agreement, home and away games, Jesuit and Skyview, like you mentioned, Central Catholic, Camas from a few years back. That was a home and home, but there's really never been anything in place when it comes to league versus league crossovers really until now. And there's a couple of reasons why it doesn't happen more often and why it hasn't happened since now. And I'll go into 2 of those reasons. Number 1 is the Oregon schools really don't need it, because one of the things that differentiates the 2 high school associations, the WIAA and the Oregon Schools Activities Association, is the OSAA is very top top heavy down. And so they are responsible for putting schools in certain leagues, whereas opposed to the WIAA, it's very membership driven. There's a lot of power within the leagues in the 9 districts across the state. So you look at the majority of the leagues across the 6 classifications in Oregon, and really there's a minimum of 6 schools. There's a lot of 7, 8 school leagues. And so when you look at the number of non-league contests, there's really no need to go across the border and play schools in other states. Now, there is an exception for a sliver of Eastern Oregon that really kind of hugs the Snake River, that really relies on Idaho to fill their non-league schedule. I'm talking about the portion of Eastern Oregon that's in the mountain time zone, cities like Nissa, Adrian, Ontario, Vail. They heavily rely on Idaho to kind of fill that gap. Versus relying on schools west of the Cascades. So that's the first reason. So the second reason really has to do with the OSAA power rankings. That's how they decide their postseason in Oregon. There's no seeding committees like we have here in Washington. It's not done by humans. It's strictly done by the computer. So they use number 1, RPI, and number 2, the Collie rankings. And it's an equal balanced ranking system between the two to come up with the ranking systems that you just mentioned a few minutes ago, having the number of Three Rivers teams in those top 7 rankings statewide. So once those rankings are finalized after week 9, that's what the 1 through 16 playoff spots look like for the first round of the state playoff. So, but what's specific about the Collie rankings is they don't factor in out-of-state opponents. So you're essentially being penalized for playing a non-Oregon 6A team. Now, you think someone like John Eagle cares about getting penalized by a ranking system? No, of course. He's going to go out there and try to find the best quality opponents for the non-league schedule as he can to prepare his team for what they hope is a state championship level run. So those are 2 of kind of the main factors as to why we don't see a little bit more of it. But this week is pretty unique. So we not only have this Three Rivers GSHL crossover, but there's 7 games on our schedule with Oregon opponents. So usually we see, I don't know, maybe 2 or 3 per year. But we have 7 in 1 week, and that's a rarity.
Well, 3 of the teams in the 3A Greater St. Helens League are going to face Oregon opponents. You have Evergreen taking on Westview. You have Mountain View taking on Mountainside, which I believe is that in Beaverton?
The new school that just opened in Beaverton.
And you have Prairie going a little farther south to Dallas, and then Battleground, even though they're not part of the Three Rivers crossover, they are going to face McNary or McKay. But so a lot of crossover this week. But the way you explain that, and that's a very interesting explanation about why there's really not that much of an incentive for the Oregon schools to take part in this. It kind of begs the question, what was that process of convincing the Oregon schools to buy in and be a part of this? What was Stephen Baranowski's case that made this thing reality and able to get the Oregon schools to come over and engage in what should be some pretty compelling matchups here?
Well, first and foremost, it's quality football on both sides, right? And I think it helps that someone like John Eagle is at Westland who can vouch also for his league counterparts in the Three Rivers to say why this is a good thing to have this crossover. It helps that the 2 calendars also match up. Oregon football, it's only a 13-week season. And so not every year the schedules happen to align. So once that end of regular season in week 9 happens, they go straight into the round of 16, unless you're talking 6A football, which actually has a separate 1 through 16, and then they have what's called the Columbia Cup, pretty much a runners-up kind of style bracket for those seeded 17 through 32. So there is no technically week 10 like we have here in Washington. And because of that, there's half the number of schools basically that Oregon has. There's about 180, 185 statewide compared to about 355, 360 for Washington. But the calendars match up, the leagues match up as far as having those contests. And finally, it's just tremendous football. So those are just the 3 arguments that that I don't think need any more than further than that.
Well, I think it's a great deal for the 4A Greater St. Helens League because it's not too far in the past that those teams were really kind of struggling to find quality opponents. I mean, you've seen several lopsided games in recent years where they're like, what's anybody really getting from a running clock game in week 2, week 4, week 5? And so I'm sure if you ask the 4A Greater St. Helens League, heck yeah, they love to play a top quality Oregon school.
Right. As far as travel goes, right? Remember, the 4 GSHL teams need to fill 6 games on their schedule. So 6 of their 9 games, 2/3 of their season, they're going all over the place. So geographically, that also makes sense when you're just crossing the Columbia River to face a number of these teams. But even look at this year's schedule. Camas going up to Lincoln of Tacoma. They go next week to Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Then in week 6, they go to Monroe. Camas was this close to actually flying to Cleveland to take on a team in Ohio, a team that was willing to give Camas a check to help with the travel expenses. So it just goes to show the lengths that some of these teams are willing to go to find these non-league opponents. So next year, because this is the first year of a home-and-home cycle for scheduling, you look at Skyview, no, they're not going to Hawaii next year. Let's just get that out of the way. I know. So at last check, they were trying to schedule a week 1 game with a Boise team in Boise. So there is a long road trip. Then they have to go to Graham-Kapowsin, to Puyallup, to Richland. So yeah, when it comes to geographically making sense, absolutely. This is just another reason why the Three Rivers and the GSHL teaming up for a home and home for the next few years also makes sense. And in a league that for our 4A schools have trouble finding opponents because the majority of the 3As feel it's not an adequate matchup, and it's not.
Right. So you talk about this is the first year of a home and home 2-year agreement. What do you think is the potential for something long term to emerge from this?
Yeah. So, I've been thinking about this ever since the news of Shelton kind of coming into the mix here. And in addition to this kind of 2-year agreement with the Three Rivers is, where do we go from here as far as the 4A Greater St. Helens League? For the time being, it looks like it's going to be a 4-school league. So again, they're already traveling all over the state to try to find games. And so I got to kind of thinking outside the box a little bit about some of the other 4A, 3A leagues in this state, mostly the Greater Spokane League, and also the Mid-Columbia Conference, which is home to 9 schools in the Tri-Cities. And if you look mathematically, how great would it be if there was an agreement in place with a league like the Tri-Cities, where you have 5 4A schools, Chiawana, Pasco, Richland, Hanford, Kamiakin, and they can team up with our 4 GSHL teams for, I don't know what you would call it, more than just an agreement. If you want to throw the 3As in there as well, yeah, absolutely. They've got 4 3A schools over there as well. And so it matches up evenly as it is. So that's something, it's just kind of an outside the box idea. Why not make it happen? If you want to save a spot for your typical week 1 games against your familiar maybe opponents, rivalry games like Prairie Battleground, fine, Mountain View Union, fine. But I think it opens up the door for something a little bit unique and interesting, especially given the way that college football is right now, where you have Washington going to New Jersey to play Rutgers for a Big Ten game this weekend. So why not kind of try that expansion with high schools and have that agreement? And you can still have your league games toward the middle of October like you traditionally do, but you have something in place with quality teams. And again, you're already traveling anyway. You're just going to the Tri-Cities a couple times a year.
Well, yeah, that's just it. But people will say like, oh, Tri-Cities seems so far away. But if you're talking about matching a 5-team league and a 4-team league, that's only 2 road trips. It's a road trip that's half the distance of a road trip, say, to Coeur d'Alene that these teams are already taking. And So you really compare it to the number of miles these 4A schools are traveling anyway, and it's not an apples to oranges type of comparison. It's right in vein with what they're doing.
Right, and again, it wouldn't be football only. We're not talking about an all sports, all schools type thing. I mean, can you imagine, traveling over twice a week to Tri-Cities to play, Chiawana in a girls soccer match, and then turning around and then on a Thursday going to play Kennewick again? So no, that wouldn't make sense. But it does make sense for a football only deal.
And you would solve the problem of trying to fill the schedule, which continues to be a headache. I mean, you mentioned Union still doesn't have a week 6 opponent, or they won't have a week 6 opponent. So it would, having something formalized would take that headache off the table. But also you're talking about 2 great football leagues, and a lot of, these are the types of matchups we look forward to in the postseason. So why not wet everybody's whistle with some good football in week 3 through week 5 or 6?
Well, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, geographically, where we sit, it's somewhat of a disadvantage because the closest 4A school now, miles-wise, is Yelm, as part of the South Puget Sound League. So, again, yes, we're just across the river from a major metropolitan area, but as far as the Oregon schools go, there's not a necessity from their standpoint to kind of have something in place substantially for the next several years. But something like the Tri-Cities, like that would somewhat make a little bit of sense.
Yeah, it almost makes too much sense for it to actually happen. But anyway, what we know is that this week is going to be a lot of fun with a great comparison, I think, of the quality in football between Southwest Washington and the Portland area. We know those schools over there are, the highest quality that you're going to find in the Northwest. And so for Camas, Skyview, and Union to be able to match up and go toe-to-toe, I think is going to be great entertainment.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's going to be great football, and can't wait.
All right. Well, we will be there. We're just about to go and hash out who's going where, so I'm sure you'll have a say as to where you go. But you can find out which games we're going to be at this Friday by following us on 360 Preps. Thank you again for watching and tuning in. Our numbers throughout the first third of the season have been great, so thank you for continuing to listen to us speak about high school football. We're going to be back every week, and as always, check us out on our social media channels, and we will see you out at the field.